urged us to new ritual as something needed to tackle the deep grief of society in the face of overwhelming change and to build trust and social cohesion in the face of climate crisis. So Kim was really interested in this emphasis, and I was really interested in her work on it as well. So she is going to speak to us this afternoon, about the mourning lens, our symbolic world and death. Getting background noise. So Kimberly is Associate Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame in Liturgical Studies and is currently President at the North American Academy of Liturgy. She teaches sacramental theology and ritual studies and represents the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops on many dialogues with Protestant churches. Her current book project explores the role of ritual in responding to crisis in pluralistic societies like the US and Canada. So really interested to hear of her research. Just to orient you to the program, we'll have about a 20-minute presentation from Kim, a response from Pam Werntz, whom I will introduce at the time, and then an opportunity to be in breakout groups and come together with questions and answers. We are timing this for an hour and a half. So welcome, and I'm going to ask Lucas to open us with prayer. Thank you.
Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, you are in the world all around us, in the wind, in the sunshine, in the rain. You are within us, creating spirit, in our hearts and in the faces of those we meet. Make us aware of your presence, especially during this webinar, as we learn, listen, and meet new friends. Bless our time together in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Lucas. And over to you, Kim.
All right. Thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. So I this work that I'm doing right now, the research project that I'm doing, is trying to create bridges between what we know about rights for crisis for individuals and sometimes communities that are going through times of great stress and distress, and then also how we translate what we know from those types of situations to bigger situations like social crisis and also eco crisis. So I'm really, in a way, just starting to figure out how this works in terms of ecocatastrophe. But what I wanted to talk about today is what kinds of techniques can we expect people in pluralistic contexts to be able to enter into? Because I think sometimes when we think about how to do ritual with people, not everybody in our societies has like the right kind of skills to participate in Christian liturgy, kind of more traditional types of Christian liturgy. And so what kinds of but we want, to invite everyone really into the climate catastrophe. We need everyone to participate in thinking through the problem of how to ritualize around climate catastrophe. And so part of what I'm going to be talking about today is techniques about land that are drawn from pilgrimage. And I'm actually going to argue that we might think that people today don't know how to be pilgrims. I teach at the University of Notre Dame, and which is mostly known for our football team. And every fall, we have people come to campus to do an impressive set of rituals around the football games. and they know really well how to participate. And so part of what I'm thinking about is like, how do we use the techniques of travel, of pilgrimage, of tourism, to help people mourn and see their land lamenting climate change. So I have a bunch of pictures, and I am going to kind of share, because I think it helps to be able to see things. I'm going to share some of the pictures that I brought. So I wanted to start kind of orienting us with the ways that we as Christians have more traditionally associated our land with mourning, and with practices surrounding death. And this project that I'm working on, one of the things that I did was go to the St. John's Abbey for All Saints and All Souls Day last fall, and kind of pay closer attention than I might sometimes pay to how our rites of All Saints and All Souls Day in my own tradition in the Catholic Church ritualize death and pay attention to space. And of course, one of the things that's inspiring to me is that traditionally in my own tradition in the Catholic Church, we have pilgrimage shrines that are associated with places where people have died, especially people who really suffered for the church. So we have these spaces that are made sacred by our mourning practices. And I thought, I think that's a good place to start, to think about these practices of remembering the dead, and of kind of progressing with the dead. So I'm going to kind of run through these. I know I only have 20 minutes. So this is the reliquary chapel at St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. And here you can see these sort of candles sitting on these various things that are demonstrating, I think, an interesting connection between mourning for those who have gone before us, mourning for those who have died, and then also looking towards a future, even though we can't totally envision that future yet, looking towards a future where there's some kind of hope, what I would say is like an unimaginable hope. And I think holding those two things in tension is really important in the climate crisis. One of the things that we see people really wanting to double down, I think, either on strategies that are going to somehow prevent climate crisis, or on a kind of despair that makes it really difficult to even gather to talk about the climate crisis. And I think in our rites surrounding death in the Christian tradition, we see an interesting tension between lament and hope, but a kind of hope that doesn't point to a specific future that we foresee, but kind of remains remains comfortable, maybe that's not the right word, but remains familiar with a lack of knowing. And I think that's kind of what I find inspiring about this. So one of the things, so I'm just going to highlight some things that were done at the Abbey last year that I thought were helpful. So in this image, you can actually see the relics of the Abbey set out and put all around the church rail here, and then around the abbot's chair, and in other places in the church building. And it kind of made the dead present. And I think one of the reasons that we struggle with climate catastrophe is because we have this North American struggle with death in general. And so I think thinking about how to make our dead present with us is one of our challenges. So this is just an interesting way of doing this. Here I have just kind of briefly, this is how the All Saints Vigil liturgy went. It's not what we would expect, I don't think, where you have like nothing but lament. It's a really interesting, again, tension between our lament and then also our hope, which comes from God. So we have, for example, Psalm 31, which is thanksgiving, Psalm 61, which is a lament, and then Psalm 34, which is taste and see that Lord is good. It's a really nice liturgical progression. Similarly, in All Saints morning prayer, there's this kind of reminder that what we get our hope from is not from human activity. It's not, which again, I think, in terms of the despair of climate catastrophe, which I think is actually one of the causes for why people don't want to engage with it at all. I think this is one of the things to remind us that it's not all about what we do, but it's actually about putting trust in God. So there's also this Day of the Dead tradition. I don't have time to highlight a lot of this stuff. So then the prayer on All Souls Day, rather, was actually in the monastic cemetery. You'll see it's a really warm day. I actually thought of global warming as I went out there because for November, it was very hot in Minnesota last year. And I think, that thinking about cemeteries as the space where we combine mourning and hope, and again, this space where people can get comfortable with the nearness of death, is another kind of tradition to look to as we're thinking about climate change and ritualizing around climate change. I also wanted to highlight the Whitney plantation, but let me first talk a little bit about pilgrimage. So I think one of the challenges that I've been working with a lot is how do you invite people in to ritual when they don't know how to ritualize, and a lot of what we're asking them to do is unfamiliar. So for example, I just gave you these examples of All Saints and All Souls Day, but a lot of these are reflections on biblical passages, which even for regular practitioners who are Roman Catholic in my own tradition, they might have very little understanding or knowledge of the Psalms. And so these things can seem like a really heavy lift. And also I know in other contexts, putting relics around the altar is maybe not the best strategy. So I was thinking about tourism as a set of things that people know how to do, kind of don't need to be taught, but that they sort of naturally do. And I know when we talk about tourism, we have a tendency to really downplay tourism and think badly of tourists, which is sometimes fair. But I also, if I think about the last few times my family has gone on vacations and done tourist things, it can be really a thoughtful set of practices. It's definitely very meaningful for people. And people really learn a lot from their trips, and in a lot of cases are really deeply emotionally engaged in what they're doing. Like, for example, I've been studying what people do at museums, and these are some of the things that people do at museums. And the museums I've been studying are sites that are racially charged sites. And so these are like very deep, and for a lot of people, even very prayerful activities that they're doing at these sites. So I was wondering, whether we could think of creating spaces for people to progress through, where they can use these these strategies, these techniques that they already know, that I've listed here, taking photos and selfies, leaving a record of themselves. I'll show you, I think, a couple images of that here. Purchasing or taking home souvenirs or gifts, or progressing through a site, following signs, like deciding what to see, comparing it to other things they know, taking in information. These are all really active. And I think if we look at traditional pilgrimage sites, actually, we see a lot of these same actions still being used at tourist sites today. So let me take a look at the Whitney plantation. So who is it that's here from New Orleans? Sorry, Andrew, if I'm telling you so many things you already know. So what I'm really interested in, what they're doing at the Whitney plantation. The Whitney plantation is historically a sugar plantation. And what they're doing there is they're trying to lift up the experience of enslaved Africans and their descendants at this site. And one of the things I think is really interesting about it is that it's taking narratives that we usually don't pay attention to when we're in a place, and it's actually making them part of the land so that we can experience them. So here is a kind of more traditional touristy plantation experience with palm trees and water fountains and things. And part of what this image, what I want you to see in this image, is the way that we cover up knowledge when we go through a place. So this plantation is supposed to seem like a wonderful place to be. And part of what they're doing at the Whitney plantation is they're lifting up evidence of the way the land has been misused. In this case, they're thinking about slavery. And first of all, that's important to me because the most recent discussion ecumenically about climate crisis has encouraged us to remember that climate crisis isn't just about the non-human ecology, but also the ways that it impacts unequally human beings in their use of the land. And I think that's important. And when I went to the Whitney plantation, one of the things that was really striking to me is the way that the slavery of Louisiana was always from the beginning a way of exploiting the natural environment and trying to strip it of all of its resources to benefit a few people at the expense of a large number of other people. So there's actually an ecological narrative there from the beginning, even though, as you can see, I'm not totally sure how to tie together that narrative right now. The way the Whitney plantation is organized right now is to lift up the experience of enslaved Africans and their descendants who live there. And one of the things that they do, let me go back to this slide for a minute. So one of the things they do is they kind of orient the land so that towards the river is where the white people lived, and away from the river is where increasingly was slave space. And they suspect that there are burial grounds for enslaved people in certain parts of this plantation that are farther from the river. So there is kind of this way in which the bodies of the dead and the sacredness of this land and the exploitation of this land are all linked together. And then one of the things I learned at the Whitney plantation was that the way we present the land really matters. So for example, here we see this really lovely avenue of oak trees, which has not been there since time immemorial. Oak trees always seem like they've been there since time immemorial, but these were planted to shade tourists and kind of make for romantic wedding pictures. So part of what they're doing here is like thinking about the way that the landscape has changed over time, and the way that change over time is linked to how this land was being used and misused by human beings. And that's something I think that we could work with. Another really important thing is kind of the framing of what is here on this site. So instead of romanticizing this plantation house and the life that was led here, the Whitney plantation focuses on the artisan craftsmanship of this house and the way that it's suited to the climate of Louisiana. I don't have time to do more with that, unfortunately. So there's also a lot of memorials at the Whitney plantation that again highlight the individual people who lived there. So these are the people that we have records of living there. And rather than being erased from the landscape, they are instead sort of highlighted and named on the landscape. So part of what I was thinking about is the ways that we can liturgize to lift up the landscape, the changes that are coming through and in climate catastrophe, and also the way those have impacted people in the past and the present as well. So I do want to give you one more example. So this is a glacier in Iceland. And the last sort of pilgrimage that I'm going to tell you, I think I am still on time, is, what's that?
You can expand a little bit. Don't censor yourself too much.
Okay. Well, that's great. So this is a ritual that I read about in religions. I'm going to give you the citation in a minute, about a funeral liturgy that was performed for a glacier in Iceland. And this is actually a publicly available paper. So if you, and I can put the link in the chat after I close this window. So, but this is a really interesting liturgy. I've only read about it, so I haven't been there. But it's a really interesting liturgy where we have some firsthand testimony from people who went on this funeral for a glacier, who were, the funeral itself was inspired by the sort of indigenous religion of Iceland, and the way that glaciers are personalized and animate in that religious tradition. But what's interesting about it to me in some part is that we have a bunch of people on this pilgrimage who don't see the world as animate and personalized, but are still able to enter into a funeral and really participate in that emotionally and really powerfully and prayerfully, in part by solidarity with this indigenous tradition of understanding glaciers as animate and living beings. So the bulk of this article is really about the need to allow ourselves to grieve the incalculable losses that we will have through climate change, even if in the best case scenario, we manage to arrest it to the minimum possible course of possibilities at this point. But I just want to read you this one little section and then kind of reflect on it. So this is from the article of Lisa Sideris at the bottom, Grave Reminders, Grief and Vulnerability in the Anthropocene, which came out in 2020. And this is a quotation of hers from an interview she conducts with one of the participants in this pilgrimage. It says, "The ceremony for OK entailed a long walk up the mountain, culminating in the installation of the commemorative plaque. The last 100 meters of the procession took place in silence, in accordance with Icelandic tradition. Tradition also dictates that climbers may make 3 wishes as they silently approach the summit, and that they are not to look backward as they ascend. Climbers who obey these rules are said to have their wishes fulfilled. OK's rocky terrain made the hike physically challenging, and as Howe explains, she was not certain from one moment to the next whether her daughter had been able to keep up and was still somewhere close behind her. She wanted desperately to turn around, but also wished to respect the custom of forward-facing silence. On Howe's own interpretation of the ritual, ascending the mountain became a, quote, metaphor for moving forward in the climatological apocalypse. We have to keep moving forward, she says, with whatever kinds of solutions we can come up with. Yet the injunction to keep going was frustrating as she became increasingly worried about her daughter's progress, somewhere behind her. Finally, still facing forward, she tentatively extended her hand backward, not knowing who was behind her or how they might react. A second later, she says, she felt her daughter's small hand grasp her own. I started crying. So this, to me, first of all, there's like an actual description of a liturgy here that seems to have been really powerful. And the way that Howe, who's a scientist here, kind of projects her own understanding of what's needed in the climate crisis onto what's happening ritually is like exactly how ritual is supposed to work. So this ritual itself is ambiguous. It has a lot of different interpretations, but because she's here doing it, spending time doing this thing, she's able to process some of what's happening to her and interpret what she thinks she needs to do next with regard to climate crisis. But at the same time, she also has this like very powerful emotional need both to respect what's going on and to keep track of the ongoing obligations she has, even when they're in tension with this need to keep going forward. I immediately, and I'm sure for many of you, I thought of this as a kind of journey, like a almost like a like Greek, narrative, and that's actually how Siderus interprets it too. So, but this I think gives us a like really nice example of how we want these liturgies to work. It's not over-explained, and it's not. It just allows a space for her to make her own interpretation as she's working through this. And I think that's the end of what I was going to talk about.
Those are amazing examples, Kim. My goodness. I'm sorry you felt the pressure to cut it short.
There's always pressure to do that. Don't worry. It's a daily phenomenon.
So I've invited Pam Werntz, who has been, I hope I get your name right. How do you say it?
I say Werntz. You did it just right.
That's good to know. It doesn't always happen with my name. I was introduced to Pam by Amy, who is the pastor at Emmanuel Church in
Boston.
And she is involved in a project with, with the Central Reformed Temple, a project called the Emmanuel Center. And what they have done is come together as two different religious traditions with a shared history and certainly a shared ethical context. And they are preparing for a particular event coming up in September related to the climate crisis. But I don't want to overstep my boundaries in terms of what you have to say. We've listened to amazing examples of kind of natural liturgies or rituals that bring disparate groups together for common purpose. And it would be really interesting to hear from you how you responded to these examples from your own experience, and also hear a little more about it. So over to you, Pam. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And Kim, thank you for your presentation. I also just went to the Whitney plantation, and I loved being there. It was a very powerful way to engage some really very difficult subject matter. And one of the things that I think about with both the Whitney Plantation and also the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. Are there, and this is true for the African American History and Culture Museum at the Smithsonian, there are places to mourn. There are benches to sit down on, and there are places to weep and to pray. And they don't say, weep here or sit here and think about this, but there's this expanse of space and a kind of there are places where we are encouraged to feel the feelings that are coming up when we engage hard material. So I think that pilgrimage and tourism is a great model for us to think about, like how we do know how to what to do. And so backing up a little bit, Emmanuel Church and Central Reformed Temple are two separate congregations that 15 years ago or so formed a relationship, not just about shared past, but about imagining a shared future. And that's important to me, that we talk about not just the fact that we have the First Testament in common, but that we have living, breathing, good religious values that, while we differ in our practices and our rituals, maybe in our beliefs, we have a great deal of shared concern and hope for the future. So the name of our collaboration is Emmanuel Center. And the Emmanuel Center is governed by a board that is made up of representatives from both congregations that meet together to plan events. We started talking about the climate crisis and how we might bring our kind of progressive Christian and progressive Jewish voices into the conversation about the climate crisis. And we came up with the idea of using Sukkot, which is the festival, an 8-day festival of tabernacles or booths in Judaism, to as a framework for engaging climate crisis. And so the name of the program is Shomrei Adamah, which is care of the earth. And we started with our understanding from Genesis that that the divine has given humanity the responsibility to tend or care for the earth, that the land mourns and all who live in it languish because of the way the land has been mistreated. In Hosea, Hosea says that even the fish of the sea are perishing. So there's an element of lament, and we're looking in this week of Sukkot, or this 8 days of Sukkot, to engage in conversations and actions at the intersection of faith and climate and justice or inequity, recognizing that climate change is much harder on poor people than it is on wealthy people. So a little background of Sukkot. I don't know how much you guys know about Sukkot, but there's a tradition. It's a harvest festival, and there's a tradition of building temporary dwellings to stay outside. And the temple builds a sukkah on Newbury Street in Boston in front of the church every year. And we are going to have a bigger than usual sukkah so that we can welcome as many as 25 or so people at a time into the sukkah, to give thanks to God for all the good things that God has given us, and to pray for the coming year. And one of the things that struck me about Sukkot is that on the seventh day of the festival are the prayers of the great Hosanna or Hoshana, Hoshana Rabbah, which is the great Hosanna. And it occurs to me that many Christians who have a practice of singing Hosanna in the highest as part of our Eucharistic prayer or as part of our Palm Sunday ritual, hear Hosanna as some kind of different word for hallelujah or some kind of praise word, when it actually means please help us. And if I feel like if the congregation that I serve learns nothing else about Sukkot, I want them to know that Hosanna means please help us, and not praise you, praise God. Built into this ritual or this festival of Thanksgiving for the harvest is an acknowledgement that that what we have, what we've received, and what our obligations are to care for the earth come from God, and that we don't do anything apart from God. So what we're planning. Oh, let me just say. So we formulated some goals as a group. To explore our shared and distinctive faith insights into the work of responsibility for our environment, to showcase progressive Christian and Jewish theologies on environment as siblings in the creation narrative, to advocate for action regarding environmental responsibility, particularly in our homes, in our places of worship, in our neighborhoods, to celebrate all the works of creation, its diversity and adaptation, as a means to learn how to live and coexist as human species in harmony with all ecosystems. That's a big goal. To highlight the Back Bay where we're located, its kind of ecological and living past, and our responsibility for the land and the peoples of the future. We occupy territory that was once a fishing ground for the Massachusetts people. And the colonists first turned it into a sewer, and then filled it in with landfill, and that's what we occupy. So there's an environmental history that's quite violent in the Back Bay. And then to acknowledge the environmental hazards that result from human interactions with the environment. So those are our goals and objectives. And what we mean to do is each day have at least one offering in the sukkah of prayer, of education. We are inviting representatives from various groups, the Jewish Climate Action Network, an organization called Dayenu, which means enough. We've had enough, and we have enough to respond to this crisis. We're thinking of, we have several partners, ecumenical partners, who are in Christian churches in the neighborhood, who also have active ministries that have to do with climate change. We're going to be talking about legislation and regulations, and how to get more involved at the State House in Massachusetts. So we'll be touching on political action. Trying to think what else we have. We have a assisting bishop who is an Indigenous woman, and we're hoping that she will come and talk to us about the first peoples that lived on the land that we now occupy. So we're looking backwards and forwards, celebrating and lamenting, learning. And now that I've heard Kim, I'm thinking about souvenirs. I'm thinking about what kinds of things people can take with them as tokens of their pilgrimage to this sukkah, to this place, that this temporary place that will get built, just in front of the church. One of the leaders of the temple tells a story about the first year that they were building a sukkah, and a woman walked by who was an Israeli, and she stopped and looked and said to the people that were putting the sukkah together, "Is this a sukkah?" And they said, "Yes." And then she stopped and she said, "In front of a church?" And they said, "Yes." And the woman said, "Do they know? Do they know what a sukkah is?" And the answer is yes, we do. I think that's what I have to share right now. We're working on the schedule. We don't quite have a schedule yet. We're hoping that, as I said, we'll have at least 1 or 2 offerings every day. We expect that people will be able to come to 1 or 2. Most of them are on week afternoons or weeknights. But that many people will be able to experience something in this context. So I'll stop there, and then if you have questions, I can entertain them now, or I don't know, Melan, what happens next?
So what happens next is the opportunity to go into breakout groups and kind of process this in smaller quarters. So that was a beautiful example. Thank you so much, Pam. That just gives a concrete expression to the kind of examples of ritual that Kim has addressed and that we're trying to conceive of among ourselves. So knowing that you will have to leave us before the end of this webinar, maybe there are questions that people might want to ask before we go into breakout groups.
Pam?
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello, Amy.
I don't have a question, but I know enough about Emmanuel Church to wonder whether you might give people just a few sentences about your context, because I think that's part of the story and kind of the gift of this project is your particular context. If I were in a suburban congregation on a small road, it might not work in the same way that it's going to work where you are.
Right. So the context is that we are downtown in the wealthiest zip code of Boston, on both the wealthiest shopping street, and also the street that I think on any given day has the greatest diversity of any street in Boston. People who are shopping for shoes that cost $3,000 a pair. The people who work in the stores that are selling those shoes, people who live on the street, in our garden or on heating grates, people who are traveling from all over the world who are in Boston downtown. It's an urban setting with just a little bit of everything when it comes to people. The parish serves, I would say pre-COVID, it was typical for 1,500 people to come through the doors of the building each week for some reason. 12-step meetings or concerts or programs or religious services. It's a very active, busy place. Does that give? We don't have a parking lot, for instance. We can't build the sukkah in a parking lot.
Thank you. I'm going to recognize Tim.
Pam, thank you. I am wondering if you would be able to share with Amy and then to the APLM network, when you have an outline for what you're doing or whatever analog there's going to be for an order of worship, I would find that very interesting to share if you can do that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
Great.
I volunteered you, Amy.
That's great. It's in October, not September. And my guess is we won't have those outlines much before the beginning of October.
That's fine.
But yes, I'm happy to share them.
Thank you.
Oh, that would be great. Thanks. So the question I want you to address, and I'm sure you'll just talk about what you want to talk about, but as a jumping off point, is just what ritual or rituals do these examples evoke in your own context? So just talk among yourselves. It would be, and questions or practicalities that arise. And we have about 15 minutes in our breakout groups. So over to you, Amy. Thank you. Says goodbye. She was great to have her here. And this is an opportunity now for sort of sharing insights from your group, questions or answers of Kim or each other. And maybe we can jump off from our group. There was a particular question that I think, Hannah, you wanted to ask of Kim
I don't remember if that was me, or sorry, there was a question I wanted to ask. I can't remember.
Something else. It was about coming home after. Was it you, Phoebe?
It was Phoebe, I think.
Yeah, I mentioned to my group that I was so excited about this idea of pilgrimage and travel and journeying, and that is a good space for these sorts of rituals, specifically around eco-grief. But that it made me think of sort of a past life in which I was leading a lot of wilderness trips, backpacking trips, canoe camping. And in that work, I learned a lot about how important it is to think about the coming home part of it all, like how you come home, how you return after something like that. And in this case, especially, just wondered if you've heard any powerful stories or have been thinking about the way that people are approaching the return home after that sort of ritual or trip.
That question for me, I'm sorry. Yeah. So I haven't actually heard a lot about it. What I have noticed is there's kind of an impulse to like leave something at the site and then bring something with you, which of course you shouldn't do on wilderness backpacking trips. But it does seem to be like a really powerful strategy in these kinds of things. I mean, we know like this is a challenge for pilgrimage in general, is like how do you make this experience an ongoing part of your identity. I do think that is part of what motivates people to do things like take photos and get souvenirs, is this that people deeply desire to kind of make that an ongoing part of their identity. But offhand, I haven't yet run into any stories about people who have done it successfully. So
Thank you.
If I could just add a word on that, this is a little bit different, but I think it's connected. In our group, we ended up spending some time talking about stories and the process of our telling our own story and constructing our own story. And the potential for pilgrimage or some kind of experience to shift how we tell our story, right? But then making space perhaps before and after for people to tell their stories, to see how that story shifts. And I mean, that's very basic to our life of faith, right? That our scripture and our experience in community and our liturgy shapes us, shapes our sense of who we are and the story that we tell about ourselves. But a member of our group who seems to have had to leave made the really good point that very few people have the chance to really do that in any kind of like conscious way these days. So that can be a gift of all this as well.
So speaking of stories, Hannah has an amazing story to tell in our group about her experience in working with her community in West Virginia. So go ahead, Hannah. Just say a bit about what you were sharing with us.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'm kind of was drawn to this webinar because I think a lot about eco grief in the sense that I currently live in West Virginia, which is a place where the death of the coal industry has brought people a lot of grief, partly because it's livelihood, it's culture. The coal industry built schools and churches and town squares, and so its leaving has also like left a lot of economic devastation here. People have a difficult time kind of seeing what new possibilities could grow here after these extractive industries have left. And I was talking about how there's a documentary that just came out from a West Virginia filmmaker. The documentary is called King Coal, and there's a scene in it where they practice sort of saying goodbye to the dominance of the coal industry by having a funeral with sort of somewhat traditional Appalachian funeral rites, where they turn the mirrors backwards and they make a coffin out of like hand-hewn wood, and they open the windows, sort of let the spirit leave, and they burn the coffin, and they have everyone read like a poem or sing a song. And it's very sort of somber and non-judgmental. It was really cool to see this in the documentary, to sort of see everybody from all of the different walks of life, just basically saying, no matter how we feel about this, no matter how we felt about this, or what impact it's had on our lives, we know that it's gone, we know that it's leaving, and we need to say goodbye to it, because if we don't, the language in the film is that they will get, if we don't let this industry die, we will get trapped with its ghost, and you can't live with ghosts. It's a really, really beautiful film. So I think a lot about how to gather people together to talk about that kind of grief in a way that is very sort of open-ended, and lets people just feel any type of way that they want to feel about the way that our economy is changing here.
Amazing.
Any other? Thank you, Hannah. It was so the documentary is called King Coal, spelled C-O-A-L.
Yeah, let me type it in the chat actually.
That'd be great. It sounded so good. Any other examples, questions, stories that came to you in your small groups?
I wanted to ask Kimberly to put the article, the article. I'm sorry. I lost her name. Great, Lisa H. Sedaris. If you'd put that link to her article about the glacial.
It's in the chat.
Great, thank you. That's it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I do also have, I can put a link to the slideshow if people would want to be able to look at that again. Everyone always does somehow.
Yeah, for sure. The webinar will be is taped and it will be circulated, but it's good to have those as well. Thank you. So I think we are coming to a natural conclusion. This has been really, really thoughtful, provocative, inspiring, hopeful in its own way. So thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you especially, Kim, for your preparation. And in absentia, thank you to Pam for her story and example.